we have had a tremendous evening with you here at our first virtual convoy, coming to you live from Washington, D.C., from the Gateway Marriott. And to close out our evening, we've asked our chairman of the board, Wayne Hanson, to come back and join us to share with you a story that really conveys why it is that we do what we do and why it's made such an impression on you, Wayne.
Thank you. I've got to say that oftentimes people will say, you've been involved with Wreaths Across America for many years. Why do you do it? What does it mean to you? And I relate back to the time when I was, or still am, the location coordinator for Arlington National Cemetery, but it was in 2013, a year that we didn't have enough sponsorships of wreaths or donations in order to cover all of Arlington. There's over 400,000 people buried at Arlington, and we didn't have enough wreaths to cover each of those markers that they had there. And when those last wreaths are placed and the people leave, the volunteers leave, my wife Ann and myself go back the following week, and we do what we call special requests, where people sponsor a wreath and then say, I want to make sure that my loved one, my son, my daughter, has a wreath placed on their marker. They are buried in a section that was covered last year, so they knew that they weren't going to be covered this year because the cemetery moved us around each year when we couldn't cover the whole cemetery. So it was 2 or 3 days after Wreath Day, and I was carrying a wreath into a section that wasn't supposed to be covered with wreaths that year. And the volunteers, some of the volunteers had placed, there might have been 50 or 60 wreaths that were scattered in this section, placed there by volunteers or some family members. And as I walked through carrying a wreath for a special request, looking for that marker so I could put it down to thank that veteran for their service and sacrifice, there was a man standing in the middle of the cemetery. As I walked by, he's looking out and seeing thousands of wreaths surrounding that section. And he said, "Excuse me, could you tell me what all these wreaths are?" So I proudly stopped and talked to him about Wreaths Across America and told him we were there to thank the service member for their service and sacrifice. And he said 4 words to me that hit me in the heart. He said, "What about my son?" And I looked down, and he's standing in front of his son's marker. And it just so happened that that row that his son was buried in, there were 6 or 8 markers that came up to his sons, and they had a wreath placed against them. And when he said, "What about my son?" realizing that there were no more wreaths to place, it hit me so hard, and I said to myself, I wonder how many other people come to Arlington after Wreath Day, and they see that all the wreaths have been placed, but yet their loved one doesn't have a wreath on their marker. I pledged to myself at that time, I said, I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that Arlington gets covered, every marker, so nobody has to come to Arlington and say, "What about my son? What about my daughter? What about my husband?" That they would have a wreath there. And then realizing that at that time we had over 1,200 locations throughout the country back in 2013. And I said, I wonder how many others go to those other cemeteries when those last wreaths are put down and their loved one's the next one. So please help us sponsor these wreaths. Make a donation. Go to the website for your local cemetery and for Arlington. Arlington grows, they bury 25 to 30 people a day. So we have a challenge every year of increasing the number of wreaths we need at Arlington to make sure that when those wreaths are placed at your local cemetery or at Arlington, that nobody has to go to that cemetery after Wreath Day and not find a wreath placed on their loved one's grave. Please help us by sponsoring. Go on the website, sponsor a wreath, make a donation, so we don't have to hear words such as, "What about my son?" again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hanson, and that is the mission. And please make sure that we don't have to answer that question, what about my son? What about my daughter? We will keep our lines open for you to continue donating. Tonight is just the beginning. You can give once again at wreathsacrossamerica.org/WAATRK. Help us fill those trucks.